All right, we're back. I so apologize to our audience, to Dave. It was on me. My headset stopped working, so I had to literally switch out my Bluetooth one for my wired one, which is probably what I should have started with to begin with. So at least I had a proactive recovery plan right here and waiting. So we're back. And the question that we asked Dave before we got cut off was, what is the importance of developing leaders to be critical business thinkers and owners of the business, regardless of the area they're leading?
Yeah, so I've identified as a sort of prelude to this, there's at least 4 topics in that one question. I mean, there's one about what are the importance and challenges, 2 is the notion of developing leaders, 3 is the idea of critical business thinking as opposed to ordinary thinking, if you like. And then lastly, there's this notion of business owners and what that might mean. And I think we could spend a lot of time talking about each of these subjects in isolation and then even more time talking about how they sort of mesh together. So I thought I'd focus, Mark, on just the last part of it, if you like, initially, and then maybe you can steer the conversation where you want it to go.
Okay.
This idea of a business owner and why that might matter and what might it look like and how do you determine if it existed in your business and so to sort of set the context for that, if you like, whether I, in my own mind, modeled this was, if you think of the business as a continuity, on one end of this continuum, one could hypothesize a business that was essentially a set of systems and structures and tools and tangible assets in which humans fill the gaps between the systems. So the human would bridge between systems, and the systems would be there to operate the business. I guess to objectify that a little bit, maybe a highly automated manufacturing plant might be something a little bit like that. And that's not to denigrate the roles of the individuals in that kind of context, but something which is highly system or infrastructure dependent, as opposed to the other end of the spectrum might be a business that was where the infrastructure of the business facilitated the creativity and collaboration of the humans. And the human was the capital. And then there's things in the middle. And I guess I just wanted to draw that distinction to sort of set the context a little bit. Most of my experience has been in a business in the latter type of model where the infrastructure is there to facilitate the interaction of human beings and optimize the human endeavor and create the context in which humans can bring, if you like, their best to the business. So my experience is kind of tainted by that one way or the other. I'm sort of slightly biased in that direction. So that just sort of provides a little bit of context to, if you like, back up the way that I would talk about what a business owner is. And then there's a sort of secondary consideration, which is, is it reasonable to expect everyone within a business to emote in the same way about business ownership and to experience the same sensation of ownership? And
right.
Is that a reasonable thing to expect? And I guess my take on that is that it's probably not reasonable. There are probably roles within a business, even the sort of more human-centric part of that continuum, in which it is not reasonable to ask employees to experience the same sense of ownership of the business as a CEO. And somewhere between, if you like, the person who experiences ownership least and the CEO, there's some form of, again, another continuum.
But if I were to interrupt you just for a moment on that, let's focus on executive. So, because they're not the bottom of the organization where people are more going to have a little bit less ownership. What's the level of ownership that you would expect from your direct reports as a CEO? And what would that mean in terms of how you need to lead them so they can have that ownership? Because obviously you feel a sense of ownership. The problem is, if your sense of ownership is so strong, then why, as a direct report, do I need to have a sense of ownership? I'm going to leave that up to you. So how do you work with your direct reports in such a way, or how do you lead your direct reports so that they do have ownership, in addition to you having ownership? And is it ownership for their area, or is it ownership for the whole business?
Right.
And how do you foster that?
So I understand the nuance there. I think the way that I've talked about this in the past, and I don't think I don't think it should be restricted to an executive level. And I think there are problems. There are problems associated with thinking about it that way, because it implies we can categorize the way people respond to emotional stimuli based on whether or not they're an executive. I don't think you can do that. Humans respond to emotional stimuli based on the fact that we're all
yes, but the role is different. It's not it's partly a human issue, but in my role as an executive, I literally am part of a team that's making decisions that affect everybody else in the organization that in many respects they don't have full control over.
Correct. That doesn't mean they shouldn't experience some sense of ownership, though, if we can agree on that.
Sure,
right?
sure. Absolutely.
So then I guess the way that I have talked about precisely this debate, by the way, in the past, is through what I'll call the notion of corporate citizenship. And I don't mean that in a dictionary type manner. The way that I've sort of used that as a means of having a conversation with people who I wish they experience more sense of ownership is the idea that as a corporate citizen, as an employee at whatever level you might exist in the business, admittedly way more so at a senior and executive level, is that notion of being an employee brings with it certain rights and responsibilities. And if we to categorize employees as citizens of the business, then all employees, CEO or guy sweeping the corridors at the end of the shift, they have some form of skin in the game with the business. Their livelihood depends upon the success of the business, and therefore they would have expectations upon the leaders of the business to behave in certain ways and to be qualified and competent and motivated and engaged and acting in the right interests of the business. They would have those expectations. And that would be, if you like, a right of citizenship would be that everyone in the business would share in that sort of governance process with the right intentions. A corollary to that, though, then is with citizenship comes obligations as well as rights. And so as an employee at different levels of the business, whether you're an executive or an engineer leading the development of part of a project, that citizenship brings with it obligations for transparency and obligations for creation of a local context in your part of the business where, not that everyone exists in a monoculture, but that part of a leader's responsibility is to create a local environment in which the people under that leader's supervision, if you like, can function at their optimum, and that their contributions are aligned with and coherent with their counterparties in other parts of the business. So to your earlier point about, no matter where you sit in the business, ownership isn't about your piece of the pie; it's about the pie. Mm-hmm. It's about how does the aggregate set of outcomes that we're trying to create add together in order to produce the outcomes that the business is searching for, and in a deterministic, highly rehearsed environment where competency is encoded in processes and encoded in systems, I think you can take your hands off that control a little bit more as a leader, and you can be a little bit further away from it, and you can use data to convince you that the system is working properly. In a different environment where the endeavor is not necessarily codified. Most of my background and my time in industry has been in bottom-up development type situations, which are largely without precedent. Nobody's done some of these things before, or if we have done them before, they've been in a very different context or in a different scale. So creativity and newness are generally part of the problem set, and and in that context, it's much more difficult to mobilize a large team, occasionally across different geographies, absolutely with different disciplines and different areas of interest, and bring cohesion to that team to produce the set of outcomes that the business is looking for. I don't think there's a way to do that without engaging human beings in a holistic sense, in finding ways to come together and collaborate and bridge traditional boundaries and have a perspective of success which is beyond my job description element of success, and be empowered in such a way that when the inevitable obstacles are encountered, then collaboration can happen at the if you like, the least, what is the way to say this, at the lowest level of competence and empowerment to resolve.
Yes. So let me ask you this question, because I think it's really an interesting point. When you think about your executive teams in the past, because obviously if I have that consciousness, if I have that intention as part of my role to have kind of what I call shared ownership, it's an ownership for the business, not just my area. What percentage of executives that you've met along the way as your direct reports, what percentage come in with that consciousness already in place versus ones that don't have it, that you sort of had to up level their thinking and their perspective and their mindset so that they did consider the whole business?
I mean, that's a good question. I'm not sure. In fact, I know for sure I can't give you a correct answer.
Not an estimate.
An opinion. I mean, I guess my sense is, and I think I think that the problem with responding to that is it depends when you start the clock, right? Like when you said come in with that trait already and set, like when did the clock start? At what point did we start the clock?
When they enter the executive team, or when you first meet them.
Right. But so let's use that when I first meet them. I think there are not many executives that have that as an inherent, immutable characteristic.
Yeah, and that's what I would agree. That's
not many. I think it's a rare thing, but I don't want that to sound like a criticism, because where I was going to go and why I sort of suggested it's important where the clock starts is because there isn't such a thing as a single executive. There's an executive in a context. And if I'm a new guy joining an existing executive team, I come with thoughts and biases and anxieties and fears and aspirations and motivations that are as yet undiscovered by anybody else on that team. They don't know what I want, and I don't know what they want, and I don't know their history, and they don't know my history. They don't know what motivates me, and I don't know what motivates them. I don't know what they're afraid of. Do they consider me to be a threat, or am I a welcome addition to this team? And that sort of social construct, I think, has to evolve over a period of time. And I think part of the leader's responsibility, a significant part of it, is to create the right social construct in which that sense of ownership of as part of a team, as opposed to protectionist, look after my part of the business and provide suitable excuses why things didn't work out for everybody else. The natural, if you like, the more natural human trait is to be protectionist and defensive. And it's less natural to be open and vulnerable and collaborative at a very senior level.
So what is it that you do then? If I'm your direct report, and I'm pretty much about my functional area, I think my job is optimizing my functional area, and I don't think much about the rest of the business because I'm expecting everybody else to do their job and leave me alone for me to do my job. What kinds of things might you do to help broaden that person's perspective, or to help shape that into more of a ownership for the business as a whole instead of just this functional area or her functional area?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to see if somebody would actually admit that out loud and say that.
Well, they may not admit it, but
I agree. In most cases, it would never be.
They operate that way. It's not like it's
operate that way. I think it's. I guess the way that I would sort of try to have a conversation about that is like if you consider vantage points on the world, you want to go look at a valley, the beautiful valley somewhere. There's lots of beautiful valleys in the US. You want to look at the valley. You can stand in the valley floor and you look at it and take a picture. You'll see one view of the valley. You can climb a mountain, you see a different view of the valley. You can climb a different mountain, you see a different view of the valley. and everybody's view is at least partially correct, but nobody's view is fully correct, because it kind of depends on the vantage point. And I think that highly mature individuals tend to have a capacity where they can imagine, my view of the world is partially correct and partially incorrect, but for sure it's incomplete. And therefore I need to be willing and curious about other vantage points from which I can see the world. Other people will not be that far on that maturity spectrum. And I think there's various ways of dealing with it, but I don't know a better way than putting the guy on top of a different mountain, even temporarily, to open the mind to possibilities. I think to engage in debate and criticize and say, you're wrong because you don't think that way. Well, that might be factually correct, isn't actually a helpful way of, helping someone progress in their own learning to get to the point where they can be open for something else. Eventually, by the way, though, the way that you described that character, that character would not belong on an executive team for a long period of time. That set of characteristics is not consistent with operating at a senior level on an executive team. So some form of leadership intervention is required there.
I totally agree with you. And I loved your solution. I hope the audience really heard what you had to say about it. Just debating about perspective and viewpoint is not helpful. But what you can do is have that person, give them a different role where they're now in charge of something different outside their paradigm to really help broaden it. And that can really help change perspectives. And it kind of leads us to that other question too of around what do you do that helps to build critical business thinking? And I know you gave away part of the answer when you said stay curious. And it's so interesting because you hear people like Brene Brown and people that are more into the behavioral modes talking about curiosity, but you're a business leader having to get business results. And I loved that, that you're talking about curiosity as well. So that is really awesome. Tell me a little bit more about how you instill critical business thinking as we shift gears a little bit, because I want to make sure to cover everything in the short time we have today.
It would be interesting to have my staff and interview them and ask them what they thought about what they're doing. Because clearly I'm looking at the world from my view. But I guess the way that I think I had done this, and again, I can't adjudicate my own success on this. You'd have to ask them. But my preference is to avoid having answers wherever possible, and just questions.
I love that.
And then maybe encourage. And again, it's an encouraging thing. It's on this sort of continuum of leadership interventions at a senior level. For the thing that I've seen be absolutely least effective is direction, is kind of telling people what to do. I don't think that works much for humans at all. But at a more senior level, and especially where guys have been typically, and this happens, I think, more than we probably realize, are promoted on the basis of technical competency and domain-specific knowledge, rather than native human leadership skills. And that gets you so far through your career until you realize something's not working for you,
right?
Because you're trying to use the same things that have worked in the past, and where your technical knowledge could dominate the battlefield, if you like, from an intellectual perspective. And then there comes a point when that no longer happens anymore. And as a leader, if you're not internally curious about yourself, then you get stuck.
Yes.
So I think that, again, if I use myself as an example, I probably went through exactly that process where I relied upon a certain skill set to get me so far in my career, and then started to have problems, and like figuring out, why am I having problems? Like why am I not able to lead and create the types of outcomes I'm trying to create for the business? Something's got to be wrong with me, or something's wrong with everybody else, or something's wrong with all of us. It's much easier, I think, to be introspective and figure out what's going on for yourself, what's working for yourself and what's not working, and how do you relate to other people, than it is to externalize that problem and make it about everybody else.
Well, and I just want to take a pause for a moment, because I think what you're saying here, I've got to highlight, because you've said a couple things that in my mind are absolutely critical. The one thing I notice with executives that especially are, let's just even say, in a growth mode, where they were super successful managing, a team of 500, but now they're managing a team of 1,000, or a group of 1,000, or organization of 1,000, or 1,500, or whatever that number is. And they almost always think that what they did before to be successful is what needs to be repeated now. and they even assess their direct reports, who are now in that same role, as if, well, you're not doing what I did, and I did it and it was successful. Why aren't you doing it? And I know how to do it. And you've said two things that to me are really important, and that is, one is that you have that curiosity of, what do I need to do to change? Where am I at? What is not working for me as an inner issue? And then and can I be curious enough to include other people in coming up with the solutions, rather than me having to be the solution, or expecting one of my people to have the solutions? What level can I actually bring a community of people to say, hey, this is new for all of us. How do we think the best way to go is using all of our different perspectives and critical thinking? But it also starts with that self-analysis that I think a lot of people don't have the courage to do. And the other thing that you mentioned that it makes it really different as well is, you try to not have the answer. You try to come up with the questions that are going to lead to answers. And for some reason, as I coach executives, that's one of the number one things that I am trying to get my executives to do. Ask questions rather than have your answer, because that's the only way I know of to develop critical thinking. Critical thinking is not about answers. Critical thinking is actually about questions, in my viewpoint.
Yeah, and it's about many things, I think, but I agree entirely with that. I think what it's also about is the suspension of judgment, and not assuming that most people who get to senior levels in businesses are relatively smart and can figure things out pretty quickly, and that's a necessary skill set. But it can also be problematic if we assume that this is the totality of information available on a certain issue, then I got it. Next, let's move on. I think there's a need to be able to suspend judgment and test thought processes and thought patterns against contravening opinions. And part of this discussion, if we were to talk about it forever, we would eventually end up with the topic of ego and egocentricity. And when we get onto succession planning, we'll probably come back to this topic. But I think where the ego is involved, if the ego exists, it prevents curiosity. Where the ego exists, it prevents suspension of judgment. Where the ego exists, it prevents self-reflection. And all those preventative things that get in the way of successful critical thinking are buried in the subconscious and manifest as rationalization and a set of excuses that can be argued for a certain course of action, rather than an executive saying, well, I want to do that because it makes me feel insecure to do anything else.
Yes.
Like, you're never going to hear that in a boardroom or in a senior level meeting. That's never going to be said, but it's lurking in there somewhere. To your earlier example about the executive that, hey, my job is just to optimize my piece of the world, and everybody else has to kind of then live with the consequences. There's a self-protection mechanism at work there.
Yes.
Something that says, I for whatever set of reasons I convince myself that's what success looks like, because it's safer for me to think that way, because I feel in control of my assets and my resources, or because I understand my process, I don't understand the rest of the business. For whatever set of reasons, there's some form of egocentric insecurity at play. Those issues are extremely difficult to A, surface, and B, deal with. There's not a Band-Aid, there's not a book that you go read, then all of a sudden you're a different person.
Right.
the hard problems to expose and deal with.
Yeah. That is great. I again so love what you're saying, and the whole conversation around ego, which is not a negative thing, but if there is a shadow side to it, ego is what gets us up in the morning and gets us to go to work and take risks and try new things and all of that. But ego can also be the one who wants to control, the one that wants to keep things the same, the one that avoids vulnerability and that type of thing. So I think you're raising such an interesting issue, and that kind of lends me to kind of the next question is, how do you get people, or one thing that you talk about that we've had conversation about is the challenge of many executives is that they're actually not solving the right problem. and how do you what do you mean by that, and how do you start to set direction and raise the bar without micromanaging, at the same time of getting people to really understand what is actually the right problem to solve, rather than the symptom that most of us are trying to address for short-term gain, but honestly just creates more problems?
Yeah, I mean, if you were to sort of step outside business, and I'll not get into any specifics, but if you were to look at the political domain, just about every Western country at the minute, you could find classic examples of where governments are spending untold amounts of money and time trying to address the wrong problem. And usually it's done for some form of expeditious reason. It creates goodwill, or it makes people look like they're doing something useful. But doesn't actually produce any outcomes that are of any significance in the sort of medium or longer term. There are versions of that happen in business all over the place. And again, I think their root is kind of back to the curiosity thing, right? Like if one assumes that one fully understands the business, that one is responsible for, and one believes that complicated human systems related issues can be objectively and easily diagnosed, then you're probably going to jump on an answer to a question that doesn't even need to be asked. That's kind of what I mean by spending time on the wrong problem. I was actually on a course years ago with Arizona State University, and one of the teachers at the time used the term causal ambiguity to describe what we see in business, and the notion of causal ambiguity being that even for senior leaders who spent decades in their business, they still don't understand fully how the business works. They have a concept of how the business works, and they understand that to some level the interplay of departments and people and processes and tools and infrastructure and the interaction with the market and the interaction with competition, but they don't fully understand how the business works. Nobody fully understands how the business works. And again, I raise that just to hopefully promote the notion of the importance of humility at a senior level, because to assume that you've got it all figured out and you can very easily point at a set of symptoms and say, I know how to fix that, go do this. That's where I think we end up in a lot of blind alleys that suck investment and suck time and don't produce business outcomes. And it takes a degree of courage to sort of pause and sit back and again, I think in a senior leadership team context, not an individual context, bring opinions to the table to mine for objectivity, to really figure out what is it that's going on and what are we actually trying to accomplish by whatever intervention that we're trying to put in place. I mean, again, I kind of don't want to stray too close to my own personal experience because it is my own personal experience, but I think
right.
There's enough literature around there that talks about businesses that have spent colossal amounts of money on infrastructure upgrades and reform and process engineering improvements and achieve virtually nothing.
Right.
Tangible reality. And I guess that I should have spent a little bit of time researching this, but I did years ago in the context of software engineering and software development projects that go wrong. And I did some digging around DoD websites, and the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon, and they'd done a nice bit of research, which is probably old now, but I don't think its principles would have changed. In which the most investment at the time, this is probably 15 years ago, that went into software engineering projects that were in trouble, went into process and tools and infrastructure and new languages and new development methodologies. Most of industry research went into that. A lot of academic study was funneled in that direction. Yet the most successful interventions in turning around troubled software development projects were human-centric interventions. The interventions were around how do we improve collaboration? How do we improve sharing of objectives and bring alignment to what it is that the project's trying to achieve? Yet that was least invested in by industry and academia.
Because we can control process, but we can't control people. And and yet what you're saying right now actually matches to the body of work that I've been doing since 1985, which is all about accountability. And people think of accountability in generally a pretty narrow way of keep your commitments or do what you say you're going to do. I don't look at it that way. I look at it as how do we set up an environment where people can count on each other. And the problem is you can have great processes, you can have great systems, but at the end of the day, it's the people that make it work. It's not, they don't work on their own. And you can, we never seem to talk about the one thing that every professional sports team, music group, dance company, they all talk about all the time. And that is, what is the link between each of us to perform? It's like you just have to coordinate. You have to communicate. And it's not going to a class on communication skill building. It is, what do we need to communicate to move the project along, to get the results, to fulfill the process? And unfortunately, it's much easier to disregard the human element because it is so complex and we can't necessarily control it. But the way we can control it sort of is, let's perfect the process and let's perfect the system. But in reality, the perfect process in an environment where you don't have collaboration and you don't have cross communication and you have competing priorities and those kinds of things, it is still going to cause breakdown. And I think that's what you're saying so beautifully in that example, from the study that was done. It's the human element. And yet, if you look at what is practiced and rehearsed from all the performing arts teams, whether it's an athletic team, music group, dance company, it's all about the execution. They can have the music all written out, but you can have the best players, but it's not about that. It's about how do we coordinate and blend with each other and flow with each other. And I think that's what you're saying here, that as a CEO, you're focused on that. And as an executive, you're focused on that when many others might be more focused on the process. And that would be, in a way, not addressing the real root problem.
That's my experience. And that's, through one set of examples. I'm actually trying to rack my brain here in real time and think if I can find a countervailing argument that says that everything that we just talked about was wrong. I just can't find one off the top of my head at the minute. I mean, can I find a case where the human element wasn't at some point the ultimate root cause of some kind of issue?
Let me just add to something you just said, though. Let's assume that the human element isn't the only issue. Let's assume that it's a process breakdown. But guess who's going to solve that? It's the humans in collaboration. They're going to solve the process issue. If you only have the department that owns the process issue solving the process issue, I guarantee you they're not going to solve it themselves anyway.
Yeah, and again, without straying into the political domain, some of the best examples of this are in the political domain. If we want to go look around there and ask ourselves, do we really all believe that our governments are focusing on the right societal problems, or are they focusing on exigent problems that get the right attention in the press and in the media and get the support for the midterms or the next election? And the very fact that that exists so broadly, by the way, it says it's a human trait.
Yes,
to do that, and it's therefore hard to smoke that out.
Right.
Even in oneself, even in yourself, to be honest enough with yourself and say, am I focusing on the right problem here?
Yes.
Am I focusing my team on the right problem? Is there some form of, are my own insecurities or desires or wishes or concerns biasing the way that we're thinking about this problem? It's very hard to be honest with oneself even on that.
Yes. And that's why it's so helpful to have coaches that work with us. It's so I use sometimes my team to give me feedback when I'm in a courageous place to say, where am I off track? And just getting other input, because it's hard to get outside of ourselves, quite honestly. And it's yet still a skill. One of the skills that we teach in one of our programs is participate in your experience and experience your participation.
Right.
So you're fully involved, but you're also observing how you're involved, because it's that observation and that curiosity from that observation that leads to less trigger behaviors, less trigger reactions, less fear, all of those kinds of things, because we always have ourselves in a little bit of check.
100%.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to another topic, because we don't have that much more time, and I so want to get to this one. And you started to talk about it, and I think we can really address it. Succession planning, because it's such a challenge for most organizations, regardless of whether they have a system to do it or they don't have a system. In your experience, what works and adds value in terms of developing future executives and leaders, and what doesn't work? What should companies avoid that causes failure in developing future leaders?
Again, if we start off with what we haven't discussed in this conversation, which would be another 2-hour talk, would be like, what is a leader? And therefore,
Right.
when we talk about developing leaders, what do we all mean? Because I don't think we all mean the same thing.
Yes.
And we probably, any one individual potentially changes his or her mind about what a leader is over the course of their career and over the course of even periods within that career. So I think sort of step one of successful succession planning is actually trying to objectify that a bit and say, like, what do we mean? And at different levels in the business, what do we mean by a first level leader versus what do we mean by an executive level leader? And how do we assess whether or not what we define as a leader is actually what causes success in the business? Because again, we may have a tendency to say, well, this is a leader, but have we benchmarked that against a successful person and then determine to what extent does that person manifest these criteria? Because it may be that some of these criteria are applicable in one context, but not in a different context. So I think successful succession planning begins with a really high fidelity understanding of what it is that causes success. I don't like the one version of this I've used with people in the past is like, you don't learn to ski by watching people fall down and then try to not fall down. It doesn't work.
Great analogy. I love that.
So study of failure and trying to mitigate failure is not a recipe for success, if you like. And therefore, I think when we're looking at succession planning, you've got to look at successful people and success over a long period of time in many different contexts and through various different types of stressful and ambiguous situation, and then begin to build an inventory of just what are the characteristics of this person that has allowed this person to be successful over time. Not necessarily successful at that snapshot, but be able to really distinguish not just a person who was present while the business was successful for a period of time, but a person who had tangible impact, who created a resultant force. Using Newton's first law, right? An object will continue in its state of uniform motion unless it's acted upon by an external force. So what did this person who we're considering, from a succession perspective, what did this person bring to the business that tangibly caused the successes that we're going to give him or her credit for? and really get into that and dissect it in depth, back to the curiosity point. And I guess the analogy I've used for that in the past is sort of like an iceberg, right? You've got an iceberg floating along the ocean. You know, the top 10% of it is visible, the rest is not. It's my experience that usually when when succession planning processes are at work, they tend to focus on the tip of the iceberg, the sort of the more visible and easily documentable characteristics and properties of a person that we might want to write in a job description or have a headhunter go look for. Whereas most of the impact, the success-oriented impact, or brackets failure-oriented impact, if you make a mistake, is what's under the waterline. It's the part of the iceberg that you don't see. It's internal wants and desires and hopes and fears and aspirations that person brings to work with them every day. That influence every decision, that influence every interaction with every person, internal and external. It's all those sort of subordinate or subsurface characteristics, I think, that are crucially important. And therefore, having the patience to sort of stand back and observe people for a long period of time in different contexts and focus on what it is that's caused them to be successful, and then build an inventory and an understanding of that. That I think is like step one, is in terms of figuring out how to do succession planning for real, as opposed to check the boxes on an HR process.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, especially the iceberg analogy, because so often we are only focused on that which we can see and measure and look at, and like you said, it's checking off the list. And we might have some things that, they can communicate well, they can present well, but really that's still above the water. It's beneath the water that I think we ignore and don't address. And yet you seem to have been able to do that. And did you set up programs to do that, or did you just do that in your own coaching? Did you help your HR organization to do that more? Or did you?
So my personal experience on that, again, is that I've had a view of the world during my career that is maybe slightly different to some people, and I'm not an org chart guy. I detest organization charts with a passion. I think they provide excuses, and they provide artificially simplistic perspectives on how things are supposed to operate, and they create every opportunity in the world for people to hide behind the definition of what the org chart is.
Right.
So I guess my view on building an executive team was more about, well, who do I want on the team? And what are the characteristics of the people that I want on that team? And then we'll build an org chart. Once we figured out who we want on the team, we can divide the work up among the team, as opposed to let's artificially divide the work up in accordance with some overly simplistic model, and then find people who we can target at those tasks. In reality, you got to do a bit of both. You got to sort of start at one end or maybe both ends and move towards the middle. But my preference has been to build inventories of people and sort of carry around a mental. I mean, I've done this since I was 25-year-old. It started life in the form of, if I ever had my own business, who would I want to be part of that business? And it doesn't matter whether it was, window cleaning business or an engineering business or a burger shack. What kind of people do I want in that business? And like that particular person there, I would want that person in my business. And I sort of, the way I described that to myself was, it was these people, if you like, were projects.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not obviously going to name people, but let's say Mark Samuel. If I decide Mark's a project, then I detect something in you that has higher potential, and it becomes my responsibility to help you achieve that. And in accordance with whatever level of authority, positional or moral I have at the time, then you become my project, and I will find ways to get you on a different mountain, to look at the valley from a different perspective. And I'll find ways to discover what's under the iceberg, and I'll find ways to engage with you on an individual basis, and it will be different for everybody who's on my team, by the way, because we're all different. And my relationship was different with every member of my staff, always has been, and probably always would be if I hadn't retired. And I think if every leader in the business took that responsibility on and just said, I will have 2 or 3 projects at any given time, and there will be people that I am personally seeking to develop and create opportunities for, and take some responsibility for their career, then I think what happens is that the notion of succession planning becomes a built-in part of the pattern of thought that drives the business every day. It's not a process that we shake the dust off once a year and do because the HR VP says we got to do it. It's just an inherent part of every leader's thinking processes all the time.
Yes.
And it has to be, because you can't predicate everybody's decisions about what they want to do with their careers, or when they're going to have babies, or when they're going to get sick, or, right. You can't be in control of any of that. So you got to assume that everybody in the business is at least in some ways a little bit vulnerable.
Yes.
And you also got to assume that they have aspirations and ambitions, and you better discover what they are, because you kind of got a position not just for the now, you got a position for the future. And my team needs to have hope and belief that they're whatever they're looking for from a self-fulfillment perspective can be realized working with me and working with their peers and working in that context, or they're going to look somewhere else. And all that looking somewhere else and all that thinking about other things is mental distraction.
Yes.
That sucks energy out of the room, and it sucks commitment out of the employee. And you don't want that as part of your executive team.
Yeah. Oh, that's excellent. Oh my God. That was like its own dissertation on succession planning that I've never heard, that I absolutely love. It's exactly what I feel is missing in many organizations that I'm coaching. And I just want to point out to the audience, that was a multidimensional answer. It was not just what has been Dave's role in ensuring succession planning, which oftentimes we often want to delegate that to the HR organization or some other group. And that's ridiculous. You took accountability and ownership for that, but you were also there to help grow somebody from the inside out and giving them different experiences to help nurture that. But it's always the inner as it applies to the outer that you are developing with that individual. And to me, that was just excellent. And I'm the one thing I'm just so grateful for, I mean, David Rogers on my team has known you for a very long time, but this is really the first time that we've met. And I have to say, you're one of the most clear thinking, practical, and yet heart-centered executives that I've ever come across. I've come across people who are heart-centered, but don't have the self-awareness to be as good at critical thinking and root cause problem solving. They're more quick to have an instant solution and an instant, what I would call judgment about what needs to happen, rather than an inclusive approach, or now we're thinking that debate is the thing that you need to have. Let's create debate. It's not about debate, because in reality, we want to all be focused on whatever our North Star is and have different perspectives and diverse ideas, but not for the purpose of debate, for the purpose of diverse thinking and critical thinking and choosing. So you have done so well, and I knew it was going to happen this way in the time that we've had, to lay out such good, practical, meaningful, and different ideas about leadership, executive leadership, building ownership. It's just been, to me, a thrill. And maybe, if you don't mind, it would be great to have you come back where we can explore some of the topics that are most interesting to our audience, so that we could take another deep dive in some of these topics. But for now, I just want to thank you, Dave, for joining us today. Thanks to the audience as well for going through some of the challenges in technology that we had at the very beginning. Just really appreciate it. I hope everybody enjoys their weekend. I hope to see you for another episode of Conscious Business Leadership soon. Really a different kind of meeting we had, which was all about consciousness without even mentioning the word. But that's what it was about. For those of you in the United States, happy Thanksgiving to everyone. Please share your gratitude for those around you who are contributing to your life in a positive way, including a big thanks for yourself in creating the best version of you possible. And thank you, Dave, again for joining us. I hope we get to do this again. It's just so, I've learned so much, and it's so delightful being with you.
Thanks very much, Mark. I appreciate the opportunity, and happy Thanksgiving to all you folks in the US. I hope you all have a great time, and I echo the comments about reaching out and just be grateful for everyone that was surrounded by. Thank you.